All right. Hey guys. So for this week, we are on our Unit 2 notes. We're going to talk about two things this week. We're going to talk about genotype and phenotype and this guy called Gregor Mendel. Now, for your work this week, you are going to be filling out the light purple boxes of your notes. What I am really recommending to everyone is to please, guys, just watch the video straight through once. Just watch it, listen, absorb, and learn what you can. And then when it's done and you've finished it, it should be pretty quick, but when it's done, go back, use the little scroll bar at the bottom, type or click it where you need to stop it, type your notes. Just kind of scroll until you see the next slide, stop it, type your notes. All right, and just kind of keep scrolling down at the bottom and then copy your notes, copy your notes, copy your notes when you need to. But I really do recommend everyone to please just listen through straight through once and try to learn and absorb what you can. Otherwise, you're not really learning and you're just kind of copying the notes, and you're never going to really learn this. All right, kind of get the best of both worlds there. All right, so the first thing we're going to talk about is genotype and phenotype. Now, when studying an organism's traits, right, we consider both the genetic makeup or the genes of an organism and the actual trait of the organism. Okay. Now, the two things, right? The genotype of the organism is the actual genetic makeup of that organism, right? The genotype is the actual combination of alleles in that organism, right? And you hear genotype, kind of sounds like geno, gene. They start that same way. That's going to be the best way to remember this, that the genotype is going to be the actual gene. That's going to be our letters. And I'll kind of show you an example of that on the next slide. And as we progress through and we start talking about Punnett squares and everything, you'll see what I mean by that a little bit better. Your genotype is the actual genes. That's the letters, that DNA, what your body has in every single cell. Now, your phenotype of an organism is the actual physical appearance, right? And you can kind of hear that, right? Phenotype, physical appearance. They both start with that PH. All right, that physical appearance or the trait of an organism. That phenotype is determined by the genotype, right? That genetic makeup of an organism. Your phenotype is because whatever your genotype says it is. Okay, right? The genes in your body, right, in your cells dictate, they determine what that phenotype is going to be, right? And that's what this, I just kind of added this in. Your genotype tells your body the phenotype to show. All right, now if you kind of look down below that, you kind of see uh, three sets of letters and then some colors on the bottom. And so you're going to see, capital G, that's going to be, or capital G, or little g, right? Lowercase g's. I'd like to say little. All right, so you're going to see big G, or little g, right? Those letters, that's the genotype. That's the actual genes in your body. All right, now your body knows if it has that capital G, it's going to be green, or if it's two little g's, it's going to be the recessive trait. It's going to be yellow. And we'll talk more about dominant and recessive, all right, or loud and quiet traits. But that genotype, the actual letters, tells your body what the phenotype is supposed to be, right? So, or in this case, and this can be anything living, all right. And we're going to see, talking about Gregor Mendel, who is considered the father of genetics. He looked at pea plants, right? And so maybe that big G means that it was a green plant versus yellow or something like that. And so your genotype is the actual genes, the DNA, and it controls that phenotype, that physical appearance that everyone sees. All right, that's the big difference between the two of them. You have your genotype, that genetic makeup of the organism, and the phenotype, all right, the physical appearance of that organism. Now, Gregor Mendel, all right, he was the first scientist to study how traits were passed from parents to offspring. Mendel lived back in the 1800s. All right, he determined that traits are inherited in certain patterns. And surprisingly, Mendel actually completed all his work without even knowing what DNA is, or genes. It was just a lot of observation and studying. All right, it wasn't until the early 1900s that scientists actually saw chromosomes with a microscope. So he did all of this kind of just based off of looking at his plants back in the garden. Okay. Um, Now Mendel, actually, let's stick on this slide for a second. Mendel was a monk, and if you are a monk, you spend a lot of time hauled away off in your monastery, and yes, you are taking time to practice your religion, but you also have a lot of dead time. that you can just do, fill up your time with studying. And so what he studied was how, certain traits were passed down, and, why he could see, if he planted some seeds, why some traits would be passed down, but then why other traits wouldn't be passed down. And so you'll see that coming up in some slides. Um, so his experiments was he actually studied pea plants, mainly because they had contrasting traits. This just means that the traits are opposite, right? Or if some plants are very tall and some are short, it's not just like everything in between. Or they are either green seeds or yellow seeds. All right, you don't have a whole bunch of different colors. Those are the only two options. Also says that they were really easy to grow and they reproduce really quickly. All right. Mendel really focused all of his time in the gardens. So in the monastery, there are monks that will be cooks, right? There are monks that will mostly clean. Okay. He spent a lot of time growing the food, in this case, growing the vegetables, right? And so it was great. He was able to study how different traits were passed down with different plants. So he studied with the pea plants. All right. And like it says, they were just really quick. All right. So that's the nice thing is he can do a lot of studying and not take up a whole awful lot of time. Right. It's not helpful to try to study these things if you're studying them in, like, say, a tree. Right. Think of like a big tall tree. How long does it take to get that tall, right? It takes, 50, 60 years, right? What, he's only going to be able to study, one tree in his lifetime, maybe two. That's not real helpful. He needs something that's quick, that he can, crossbreed, and he can, try to see and track these traits. And so that's what he did here. He experimented with some pure breeding plants. All right, the purebred plants produced offspring with the same characteristics as the parent plant every time, generation after generation, right? And if you have a green pea plant and a green pea plant, they're going to have a green pea plant. And if you take those green pea plants and they're purebred, as long as they're purebred, right, it's going to always give you the same thing time after time after time. He was more interested in what if they are not purebred. All right. So to determine how a trait was passed down from parent to offspring, Mendel cross-pollinated these purebred plants with contrasting traits. Right, this just means that he took a purebred tall plant. Right, every time you pollinate these, and it's pollination. Right, this is like the bees, going from one plant to another. Well, you can kind of actually just do that yourself if you take like a Q-tip swab. You can swab two plants, and now you've pollinated them. Right, and that's kind of what he did. And so he took two plants that every time they were crossed with each other, they had talls. All right, and then he also took two plants that always came up pure short. All right, and then so he took a tall plant, you see right there on the left, crossed it with a pure short plant. Okay, and he got all talls, right? In the first experiment, Mendel took pollen from a pure tall plant, transferred it to a pure short plant, and all of the offspring were tall plants, right? He called the offspring F1 plants. All right, that just means the first generation of plants. All right, so if you have up here at the top are, say, the parent plants, then you have the children plants, right? It's kind of a weird way to think of it as children plants, but that's what they are basically. Now, what he really started to look at was what happens when you take those children plants and then you cross them to have essentially like grandchildren or the next generation down. All right. So in the second experiment, he cross pollinated two of those first generation plants. They then have more plants that he called the F2, the second generation. Right now, unlike that first experiment, some of those F2 plants were tall and others were short. Right, and so he was really interested in why. Right, he already knows if you take those purebred tall plants, they're always going to have tall plants. If you take those purebred short plants, they're always going to have short plants. But when you cross the purebred tall and short, well, the first time they all had tall. Now they actually have some tall and some short, right? So that's what that really sparked his interest. Okay. So he determined that some traits are actually stronger than others, and he called those dominant traits. And some traits were actually kind of hidden. You don't actually see them because they're weaker. Those are recessive traits. And he knew nothing about DNA, but he definitely knew that something coded those traits in every organism, right? It's not random. Something is telling that organism, that plant, to have a round seed or to be yellow, or it's controlling it, right? The genotype is controlling the phenotype, what you see, right? And he was only working based off of what you could see. All right, so Mendel he's considered the father of genetics because he really started this. And if you kind of look down at that picture down below, you can see here are some of the things that he really tracked. He tracked the type of the seed. Okay, so was it a round seed or was it kind of all wrinkly? And if you actually think about this, right, think about like if you get like a can of peas or you have a frozen bag of peas, some of them are like perfectly smooth, some of them are wrinkled. It's not because some of them are cooked too long and they get wrinkly. They're genetically wrinkly. All right. Some of them are yellow, some of them are green. All right, the flower. If you didn't know, when peas grow, they do have a plant. They kind of grow off the stem, and sometimes the flower is white, sometimes it's purple. All right, the pod is sometimes it's really full, sometimes it's kind of it's gonna say constricted down here, and you can kind of see where you can actually see the bumps of the seed, right, of the pea. Sometimes it's yellow, sometimes it's green. This axial flowers is when the flowers are kind of on the inside of the stems versus at the very end of the stem. All right, or is it a tall plant versus a short plant? He looked at all these traits, and I mean, he's got time, right? He's a monk, he's got time to spend studying. This is what he studied, and that's why we consider him the father of genetics, because he really pioneered this field of looking at these traits and studying what gets passed down from parent to offspring, parent to offspring. So he's just known for using the pea plants because they grow pretty quick. All right. Hopefully that kind of sparked your interest a little bit more into how we even started this journey and how genetics was started. So this week, just quick reminder, this week was the light purple boxes. Take a moment, go back through. If you want, I'll actually just click through right now, and you can stop on each one. There's actually nothing to copy on this slide. You can stop on each slide and copy your notes as you need to go through. You guys know, of course, if you have any questions as you're going through all of this, you are more than welcome to message Ms. Farber or myself on Schoology and ask us any questions you guys want. All right, guys, that's all I've got. Hope you guys have a great week and stay tuned for the next video.